Imagine being in a wooden boat in the middle of the Pacific night, no armor, no backup. Just you, a handful of men, and the sound of enemy destroyers closing in, steel monsters that could crush you in seconds. That was the reality for a small group of American sailors in 1943. They weren't supposed to win, they weren't even supposed to survive. But what they did that night off the island of Vella Lavella would make the entire Japanese Navy afraid of the dark. This is the untold story of America's secret weapon, the wooden boats that sank steel giants. The destroyer's searchlight swept across the sea like the finger of death, missing the American patrol boat by just a few feet. Chief Petty Officer Thomas "Tom" Harrigan gripped his twin .50 caliber guns, every muscle locked in silence. 23 men on PT to 164 held their breath, drifting in the black waters, while thousands of Japanese soldiers sailed unaware just ahead of them. In a few minutes, the night would erupt into chaos. But at that moment, the crew of 3 tiny boats waited in absolute stillness, proof that sometimes the deadliest hunters are the ones you never see coming. Only a year earlier, Japan ruled the Pacific at night. Their convoys, called the Tokyo Express, slipped through the islands under cover of darkness, delivering troops that kept America pinned down. The U.S. Navy's big ship sea cruisers, destroyers, battleships were useless in those narrow waters. They needed something new, something unpredictable. The answer? An 80-foot wooden speedboat powered by airplane engines. It looked fragile, made of mahogany plywood, barely armored, but it could hit 45 knots and carry 4 torpedoes. What started as a desperate experiment became one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific. The Japanese had no idea that the night they once owned was about to turn against them. Every PT boat crew was a band of misfits. On PT-164, there was Dutch Vanderberg, a Yale math professor who calculated firing angles in his head faster than any computer could. Charlie Mendoza, a hot-rod mechanic from Los Angeles who made those Packard engines scream like jet fighters. And Paddy O'Brien, the torpedo man who polished his weapons like works of art, whispering, "These beauties will make the enemy remember us." They were city kids, farmers, college grads, and high school dropouts, all volunteers who knew the odds. But what they lacked in armor, they made up for in pure nerve. Their training was brutal. Commander Wild Jim Patterson told them, "The Japanese expect you to fight fair, don't." They learned to launch torpedoes at 40 knots while bouncing across waves, to navigate by instinct when storms erased the horizon, and to strike like pirates in the night. They weren't regular sailors, they were maritime guerrillas. And soon, their daring would rewrite the rules of naval combat. By July 1943, the men of Squadron 9 were deployed to the Solomon Islands, a swampy hell of heat, insects, and constant danger. Their orders were simple: stop the Japanese reinforcements, no matter what it took. That night, off the coast of Vella Lavella, coastwatchers reported 3 Japanese transports with nearly 8,000 troops on board, escorted by destroyers. The mission was suicidal: attack from the shadows, sink the transports, and escape before the destroyers reacted. PT to 164 led the charge, engines throttled down. They drifted silently until the enemy formation appeared against the stars. 2 destroyers in front, 3 transports behind. At 1,000 yards, Harrigan could see figures moving on deck. Then the order came. 3 clicks over the radio, the night exploded. 3 PT boats lunged forward, engines roaring, torpedoes arming. Machine guns ripped the silence apart as tracer fire sliced through the darkness. 2 torpedoes left PT-164's tubes, white streaks cutting toward the nearest transport. Seconds later, impact. A thunderous blast lit the sky, the transport breaking in half, spilling thousands of soldiers into the burning sea. The second PT boat struck another transport loaded with fuel and ammunition, the explosion so violent it knocked men to the deck miles away. The Japanese destroyers fired blindly, searchlights sweeping, shells crashing into the water. But the wooden boats were too fast, weaving between columns of flame and metal. When it was over, 2 transports and more than 6,000 enemy troops were gone, victims of 3 plywood speedboats that should never have survived. At dawn, the PT boats hid among island shadows as Japanese aircraft searched desperately for them. They limped back to base, battered, scorched, but alive. Word spread fast. Japanese radio intercepts described high-speed American torpedo boats appearing from nowhere. For the first time, the Imperial Navy, once the masters of night warfare, feared what they couldn't see. Convoys slowed, escorts doubled, the Japanese began wasting fuel and ships just to protect themselves from shadows. The psychological impact was devastating. As one Japanese admiral later admitted, submarines we could hunt, aircraft we could see, but these devil boats came from nowhere. The success off Vella Lavella changed everything. The Navy poured resources into the PT boat program, creating hundreds more if faster, stronger, now equipped with radar. Their tactics inspired new doctrines across the Pacific and even in Europe during the Normandy invasion. But the price was steep. Of the 12 boats in their squadron, more than half were lost before the year was over. Still, those who survived carried the spirit of innovation back home. Dutch became a scientist, Mendoza opened a speed shop. O'Brien rewrote the Navy's torpedo manuals. And their skipper, Commander McPhersonson, would later say, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of it." For all their glory, the PT boats had as many weaknesses as they did strengths. They were fast, yes, but fragile. One direct hit could turn them into floating fireballs. Their wooden hulls, soaked in aviation fuel, could ignite from a single tracer round. The men joked that PT stood for paper target, but it wasn't really a joke. They lived with that fear every patrol. Inside those boats, space was nearly non-existent. 12 men crammed into a vessel smaller than a city bus, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations, and breathing the constant stench of fuel, sweat, and gun oil. When the engines roared at full speed, the noise was deafening, conversation was impossible, and vibrations rattled through their bones for hours afterward. The heat was relentless. Inside the cramped engine room, temperatures soared past 120 degrees. Saltwater corrosion chewed at everything: wiring, weapons, even the men's skin. They fought not just the enemy, but the sea itself. The PT boats' torpedoes, their main weapons, were often unreliable. The early Mark 13 models had a reputation for running too deep or failing to detonate. Sometimes, they'd slam into an enemy ship with a dull thunk and simply sink. That kind of failure wasn't just frustrating, it was deadly. Every missed shot meant staying in range longer, drawing enemy fire from destroyers whose shells could vaporize them in seconds. And the engines, those magnificent Packards that gave them speed, demanded constant attention. They guzzled fuel like monsters, burning through over 500 gallons an hour. Every mission was a race against both time and the fuel gauge. A leak, a clogged filter, or even one mistimed maneuver could leave them dead in the water, a helpless target under enemy guns. Then there was the weather. The Solomon Islands weren't kind to sailors. Tropical squalls could appear out of nowhere, turning calm seas into raging chaos. Lightning-fried radios, waves smashed through gun mounts, and rain flooded the bilges. The PT boats had to fight not only the Japanese Navy, but also nature's fury on a nightly basis. And perhaps the hardest disadvantage of all was psychological. Every mission felt like rolling dice with death. You never knew which patrol would be your last. Crews saw their sister boats vanish in sudden fireballs, meant they'd eaten breakfast with reduced to smoke and wreckage seconds later. Sleep came in short bursts, haunted by the sound of explosions and the echo of waves against wooden hulls, yet somehow, they kept going. They painted names like Hell's Angels and sudden death on their hulls, part humor, part defiance. They played cards before missions, shared cigarettes, and laughed too loudly just to silence the fear. Because deep down, they knew their survival depended not on the boat, but on each other. The PT boat may have been a miracle of speed and innovation, but it was also a test of endurance, physical, mental, and emotional. Every night they went out, they were gambling their lives in wooden coffins armed with courage and gasoline. And yet, those fragile boats did what no one believed possible: they made history. Because courage isn't built from steel, it's built from resolve. The PT boats didn't win the war alone, but they changed how wars would be fought forever. They proved that courage and ingenuity could defeat size and strength, that even wooden boats could shatter empires. As veterans looked back decades later, they remembered the roar of those Packard engines, the salt on their faces, and the pride of knowing they turned the darkness itself into their greatest weapon. They were small, they were fast, they were fearless. And together, they were the mosquito fleet that made the rising sun afraid of the night.